All right, now it's the time of our service for kids to come forward. Kids of all ages are invited to come up at this time, so you guys can come up and join me. So good to have you guys here. Maverick, come join us, buddy. Good to see you. All right. Well, it is good to be together today. We are continuing our story on Samson. And remember, Samson's most famous for being very strong. So everybody show me your muscles. Show me your muscles. Now give me a good flex like this. Yeah. Now, Samson, as we learned last week, he's not really a very nice guy. And he's making some really bad decisions. He's kind of like this fictional character you've kind of heard of. Emma, can we see that first slide, please? Does anybody know who that is? Who is that? Brooklyn? Hulk. What happens when he gets angry? Jackson, what happens when he gets angry? He turns into a giant. He says, Hulk smash. And he ends up making a mess. And Samson is very much going to smash some things today. He's going to make some really, really bad decisions. And it's almost like it gets from bad to worse. And to illustrate that, I have another picture. Emma, can we see that? Does anybody know what that is? What is that? Yeah, what is that? An escalator. That is the escalator at the Woodland Mall here Crossroads Mall in Portage. How many of you have ever been on an escalator before? Adults, how many of you have ever been on that particular escalator at the mall in Portage? It's a very nice escalator. And as you see in the picture, it goes up and it goes down. But in today's passage, Samson gets angrier and angrier and angrier, and it's almost like he's escalating the situation. So what I want to do is show you a video of the longest escalator in the Western Hemisphere. So let's roll this film. Wow, that is a long escalator. I timed it. It's just under 3 minutes, the total ride from the bottom to the top. But as we're going to see in today's passage, if you could go to that next slide, please. Samson, it's almost like his anger gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse, almost like he's going up this escalator. And just like I saw in that video, at the very end, he makes a huge mess. But thankfully, at the very last minute, when he's hit rock bottom, he looks up and he cries out to God. He realizes that the Lord is someone that needs to be leading his life instead of making all those bad choices. So thanks for listening. You guys can grab a piece of candy before you return to your seats. While the kids are getting situated, if everyone can open up their Bibles to the book of Judges. We're going to be in chapter 15 today. Good job, guys. If you're a guest with us today, thank you so much for being here. We're in the middle of studying the story of Samson. Now, if you've been here, you understand that the book of Judges is one of those wonderful historical books that takes place between when Joshua died all the way to when King Saul took over. Samson is the last of 12 judges, and each and every judge, just like the nation of Israel itself, got worse and worse and worse. And when you hear the role of judge, don't think of someone sitting in a courtroom in a black robe. The role of judge for God's people was more of a deliverer. But what we're going to see is that Samson made some terrible decisions, and as a result caused great pain and suffering when he was supposed to be set apart for God's purposes. And so if you missed the few weeks, the end of Judges ends like this. Emma, can we see it? Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And Samson is an example of that, where he did what he thought was right, not what God thought was right. If you missed the last few weeks, here's what we've been learning so far in part 1. Unlike the majority of God's people at the time, Samson's parents took very seriously the commands of God and the special instructions given for their very special child to be set apart by God to deliver his people from their enemies. Last week in part 2, despite the influence of godly parents, as a young adult, Samson continually disregarded God's commands as well as his special calling. This disobedience set him on a painful trajectory of violence and suffering. And sort of to set the stage for today, keep in mind that Samson has left his wife on the altar. He's murdered 30 people to pay off a gambling debt. And we find him in this sort of state of reflection, man, maybe I have made some really bad choices. But as we're going to look at this, it's important to point out that to this day, rabbis in synagogues refuse to even talk about Samson because he looks nothing like what God wants for his people. He's not really a hero at all. But what we're going to see is that he's a good reflection of Israel all put together in mirrors. That. Emma, can we see that last slide, please? As we're going to see, the story of Samson further cements this identification of Samson not only as a judge, but also as a metaphor for all of Israel, which refers to God's people at the time. For Israel has done evil, and God has sent an enemy to punishment. That's the Philistines. Yet Israel has cried out in distress, and God has sent a deliverer to save them. As Israel's sin and disloyalty have increased over the course of the Judges era, however, God's love and generosity have been strained to near a breaking point. God's work in and through Samson is one of the more attempt by God to embody in a leader both responsible accountability and retribution, as well as an unconditional divine love that cannot let Israel go. So keep all that in mind as we move on to chapter 15. It will be up on the screen. Later on at that time of the wheat harvest, Samson took a young goat and went to visit his wife. He said, I'm going to my wife's room, but her father would not let him go in. I was so sure that you hated her, he said, that I gave her to your companion. But isn't her younger sister more attractive? Take her instead. Samson said to him, this time I have a right to get even with the Philistines. I will really harm them. So he went out and caught 300 foxes and tied them tail to tail in pairs. He then fastened a torch to every pair of tails, lit the torches and let the foxes loose in the standing grain of the Philistines. He burned up the shocks and the standing grain together with the vineyards and the olive groves. And when the Philistines asked, who did this? They were told, well, Samson, the Timnite son-in-law, because his wife was given to his companion. So the Philistines went up and they burned her and her father to death. Samson then said to them, since you've acted like this, I swear I won't stop until I get my revenge on you. So he attacked them viciously and slaughtered many of them. He then went down and stayed in a cave in a rock of Edom. The Philistines then went up and camped in Judah, spreading out near Lehi. The people of Judah asked, why have you come to fight us? Well, we have come to take Samson prisoner, they answered, to do to him as he did to us. And then 3,000 men from Judah went down to the cave in the rock of Edom and said to Samson, don't you realize that the Philistines are rulers over us? What have you done to us? Well, he answered, I merely did to them what they did to me. They said to him, well, we've come to tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines. Samson said, swear to me that you won't kill me yourselves. Agreed, they answered. We will only tie you up and hand you over to them. We will not kill you. So sure enough, they bound him up with 2 new ropes, led him up from the rock. As he approached Lehi, the Philistine saw him, came towards him shouting. But then the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. The ropes in his arms became like charred flax, and the bindings just dropped from his hands. Finding a fresh jawbone of a donkey, he grabbed it and struck down 1,000 men. Then Samson said, with a donkey's jawbone I have made donkeys of them. With a donkey's jawbone I have killed 1,000 men. But when he finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone, a place called Ramath-lehi. Because he was very thirsty, he finally cried out to the Lord, Lord, you have given your servant this great victory. But now must I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? God opened up a hollow place in Lehi, and water came out of it. When Samson drank, his strength returned and revived. So the spring was called En-Hakkore and is still there in Lehi. Samson led Israel for 20 years in the days of the Philistines. Now maybe someone in your life maybe has a bit of a temper. I'm not talking like Hulk smash kind of temper. I'm talking about someone who is kind of on a short fuse. And what often happens is they'll have an outburst. Alan, no pointing at your wife. Alan's like this. Come on, buddy. But here's the thing, okay? When that person finally cools down and is a little bit more rational, you can talk to them and say, why did you choose to do that? It's not in the text, but I can't help but wondering if Samson's parents, after he had left his wife at the altar, after he had just murdered 30 people to pay off his gambling debt, does his parents sit him down and say, what is wrong with you? Why are you making these decisions? Don't you understand that God has set you apart for great things? And at some point, he realizes, yeah, I probably made some mistakes. So he's feeling bad, so he goes to visit his wife. Now, right now, Alan's going to be in the doghouse, so Alan might be good to get Lynn some flowers to make up for calling her out in the sermon. But you might want to follow what Samson does. He chooses to give his wife a young goat instead. Now, none of the Martin's goats that are going to be in the science thing, right? We don't want to offer those, Sid, right? I just wanted to clarify that. But again, in the ancient world, if you felt bad, you gave someone a young goat. So Samson travels to his in-laws' place, wanting to consummate his marriage. But remember, his father said, well, no, I thought you hated her. You left her. So I gave her to your companion. And then wrongfully says, isn't her younger sister beautiful? Take her instead. And instead of Samson realizing that it's his fault that he lost his wife, he gets angry. He gets upset. And he escalates the situation. And he says, this time I have a right. So clearly in his head he realizes that it was wrong to kill those 30 people. But he says, this time, no, I have a right to get even with the Philistines, and I will really harm them. That happens constantly in our world. When someone says something to you, what do? You say something back. When someone pushes you, you push it back. Right? How many evidences of road rage do we see? And then after the accident, the police officer says, why'd you run that guy off the road? Because he looked at me funny. You didn't know what? And so Samson in his head thinks he's justified to escalate the violence and the destruction. What does he do? He goes out and he caught 300 foxes. Now, how many people here have ever caught one fox? Anybody? Martin family? No? You guys like animals? No? Okay. I know Sarah's father, Chet, has caught a fox. And again, if he was here, he would be our fox expert. But I'm pretty confident to say it would be a hard job to catch 300 foxes. Imagine that for a minute. But this number is important because last week we saw there was 30 murders. And now to escalate the situation, Samson gets 300 foxes, ties them up in pairs, lights the torch. And keep in mind the author says this is the wheat harvest, which means it's the fall. Things are very dry. It's almost like the whole countryside is just a tinderbox. And what happens? When he releases those 150 pairs, the 300 foxes, it catches fire and everything gets burned. The shocks, the standing grain, the vineyards, and the olive groves. And keep in mind, in the ancient world, if Rick wants some food and his fridge is empty, he just goes to Family Fair, Walmart, or Costco, right? There were no Costcos in the ancient world. Everybody lived on what you grew. And so here, Samson escalated the situation where he destroyed the livelihood of an entire people group. Now, over the winter, this people group is going to starve because all of their food, all of their resources, gone in a puff of smoke. But remember, Samson thought he was justified. When the Philistines find out who did this, they were told it was Samson, and then what did the Philistines do? Instead of just destroying stuff, now they destroy lives, and they burn his wife and her father to death. It's terrible. And at this point, you would think Samson would realize, wow, I need to stop this, that this is getting out of control. I just destroyed an entire nation's livelihood. My wife and her father have been burned alive. I just need to step back. But he doesn't. He says, since you acted like this, I swear that I won't stop until I get my revenge on you. Can you imagine? He feels justified to take and escalate the conflict even more. And what does he do? We don't even know how many people, but he attacked and viciously slaughtered many of them. And then finally he goes down to a cave to lay low. Finally he realizes, now it needs to stop. But then what do the Philistines do? They then go and they camp near Judah, which is important to the story. The people of Judah come out and say, why are you here to fight us? We've come to take Samson. And then look what they say. To do to him as he did to us. Parents, grandparents, have you ever heard that before? Like maybe you're at your house and you hear your children bickering and you hear a rustle and you go and say, what's going on here? Vanessa says, Alex hit me. And Alex says, she hit me first. Has that ever happened in the Leonard family? Never? Happens in my family all the time. Judah changed the game. So what did you do, Asher? I threw the controller. Why? Why did you do that, right? It's this back and forth and back and forth. I'm going to do to them what they did to me. And then I'm going to get even. And then it gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse until something or someone gets hurt. This is what the Philistines are saying, right? So then the tribe of Judah got together 3,000. So we go from 30 murders last week to 300 foxes, and now Judah's mustered up 3,000 people to go and talk to Samson. And when they arrive to Samson, they say, hey Samson, we know you're really, really strong. And I know that you've been sent here by God. Why don't we join forces and we will wipe out the enemies of God's people? Yeah! And Maverick says, yay! That's what they should have said. Well, why? If you know your biblical history, after Joshua died at the beginning of the book of Judges, in the first verse, God's people said, now that Joshua is gone, who's going to lead us? And the Lord said, Judah will go first, and I will give the enemies into your hands. If Judah would have realized that if God was on their side, if they would have took the lead, can you imagine having Samson on your team? Again, a mighty warrior like him, but that's not what they do. That's not what they say. Instead, they say, don't you realize that the Philistines have conquered us? Don't you realize that we're outnumbered? Don't you realize, Samson, that you're making this all work? They were showing their cowardice. They were showing their hopelessness. They had given up on God's promises. And then look what Samson said. I merely did to them what they did to me. Right? Have you ever seen that? I see it all the time, right? But these petulant children are escalating the situation. They say, we've come to tie you up, Samson. Samson says, don't kill me. And they say, okay. We're just going to turn you over to the Philistines. Again, showing their cowardice, forgetting their calling to lead God's people. So they bind him with 2 new ropes, which is important. They bring him over to this hill. And when the Philistines, because they're upset. And I'm going to go on a limb here. They're worried about starving to death. So they're really, really angry towards Samson. They start shouting, and then suddenly the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully on him. What this means is that Samson is not superhuman strength because he's been lifting weights. He hasn't been taking some protein shakes. He hasn't been going to the gym every other day. What happens is that the Spirit of the Lord gives him supernatural strength. And even though they were new ropes, he's able to break those binds. He goes and he finds a fresh jawbone. Now, where's Will Billings? Will Billings checking in. You over there, Will? Do you remember last week what your job was? You would call?
I was the umpire.
You are the umpire. And when Samson touched a dead animal, what did you yell?
Strike.
Strike. So yet again, Samson goes and he plays with the dead animal. He takes the jawbone off of a carcass, and we all yell?
Strike.
Strike. And he goes and he uses this fresh jawbone with flesh on it, and he strikes down 1,000 men. Now, I'm a historian, and I can't think of anyone in human history that had some of the abilities that Samson had. What a mighty warrior to wipe out 1,000 men with just a jawbone. Imagine if he was using his strength for good things. But he wipes out 1,000 of these Philistines. He then, to show how smart he is, he says a little poem. He throws down the jawbone, but now he's very thirsty. And kids, you need to know that Gatorade was not invented yet. And so if you, after running a marathon, think about how tired you are, imagine after doing battle with 1,000 other enemy soldiers. But in the text it's clear he's dying of thirst. And finally, and what are we at now? The end of chapter 15, finally in the story, Samson cries out to the Lord. The deliverer needs to be delivered. He finally realizes that, Lord, you have given your servant this great victory. Now, years later, maybe if Samson's parents were reading this, they're like, yes, all of the investment that we made in our son is paid off because finally we see a small seed of faith. He's recognizing that these victories, this superhuman strength, is not because of his own strength. It's only because of the Lord's. And he cries out to the Lord to save him. Now, he complains a little bit. Israelites are famous for complaining. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? In other words, God, you're totally going to get made fun of if your judge, if your deliverer dies. So you don't want to get made fun of, do you? So you need to save me. And I often wonder, did Samson deserve to be saved? I mean, he's done some terrible things. Does he deserve that the Lord would answer his prayer? Clearly, the Lord still is not done with him. And what does he do? He calls miraculously water to come out from a rock, much like Moses before him. God opened up the hollow place, water came out of it. Samson drank, his strength returned, and he revived. The spring was still there when this was written. And then we have this postscript. Samson led, and the word in Hebrew there is for judged. Finally, after all of the escalation, all of the violence, all of destruction, all of Samson smashing everybody's livelihood, finally he sees himself as a deliverer that God had called him to. And he judged, or he led Israel for 20 years in the days of the Philistines. So think back to the children's illustration. We can see that, Emma. There's Samson. Now you need to know I had this grand plan that Ben Newhouse was going to put on the wig and the muscle suit, and we were going to actually go to the mall, and I was going to videotape him going up the escalator. It didn't work out timing-wise. Rachel probably would have been concerned if we were on the news for trespassing and wearing crazy stuff in the mall, but it didn't work out. So I had to put on the Samson suit. But, you know, as I thought about the time that it would take someone to go up the escalator, you would think after a 3-minute ride, if Samson was really on there, angry after and escalation after escalation, he's realized that he was headed to a very bad place. But he didn't until his head was on the ground, he was dying of thirst, and only then, when he hit rock bottom, he had no place to look but up. So thank you, Emma. You could go to that blank slide. But here's the thing. I think that today's passage, as challenging as it was, is a very good representation of what we see right now in our society. Just this week, I got into 2 different arguments in 2 different classes with 2 second graders as we were talking about what to do when you're really, really upset. And the second grader said, you hit the person who was mean to you. No, you don't do it. Yes, you do. It's what my dad said. And I said, okay, but you have to understand that if you hit him, what's he going to do? He's probably going to hit me back, and then I'm going to kick him. No, again. And so I'm having this argument with the second grader, and the whole class is like, I don't like to hit. And another one's like, I'm scared. And another kid was like, stop. It is not a good idea that if someone's mean to you, you shouldn't get revenge and be mean to them back. But that was a new concept for them. Second grade, he's arguing with me about, yeah, I'm going to hit. Now, hear me rightly. I'm not talking about the God-given right to self-defense. What I'm saying is, when we watch these incidents that happen on the news, all we see is the end. All we see is the explosion. All we see is the loss of life. We don't realize all of the different things that escalated the situation to that point. For example, another time I was teaching 7th graders. It was the very first day of school. An hour into the class, a male and a female student, out of nowhere, starts fist fighting in one of the most violent things I've ever seen in my entire life. They were trying to literally kill each other right in front of me. Now, even though it was against policy, out of instinct, I separated them, and I'm holding them like this, and they're trying to kill each other. Thankfully, the security guard heard it, takes them both away. It was so violent that I couldn't help it. I started weeping in front of my whole class. I just couldn't control my emotions because I had never been part of something so violent to have 2 7th graders literally trying to kill each other. So later that day, I met with them separately, and I said, why were you trying to kill that kid? And what I learned was over the past summer, There was bad decision after bad decision. He said this, she said that. He did this, she did that. It escalated to when they were finally in school, powder keg went off and they literally tried to kill him. But each and every kid, both of those kids separately, said, well, we have a right to do that. They thought justified. They weren't feeling bad about getting in the fight. They just felt bad that I broke it up. How does this happen? Well, we're in this society where if this person says this, then you should say this. If this person pushes, then you should push him back. If this person draws a knife, then you draw a gun. It just gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. Is this the way that God intended for His creation? No. What we see is when Christ came into the world, He came with a new kingdom perspective and said, stop. And so I want to end here with His Sermon on the Mount. Can we please see it, Emma? Here's the words of Jesus. Here's another old saying that deserves a second look. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Is that going to get us anywhere? Here's what I propose. Don't hit back at all. If someone strikes you, stand there and take it. If someone drags you into court and sues for the shirt off your back, gift wrap your best coat and make a present of it. And if someone takes unfair advantage of you, use the occasion to practice the servant life. No more tit-for-tat stuff. Live generously. You're familiar with the old written law, love your friend, and its unwritten companion, hate your enemy. I'm challenging that. I'm telling you to love your enemies. Let them bring out the best in you, not the worst. When someone gives you a hard time, respond with the energies of prayer. For then you are working out of your true selves, your God-created selves. This is what God does. He gives His best, the sun to warm and the rain to nourish, to everyone, regardless, the good and the bad, the nice and the nasty. If all you do is love the lovable, do you expect a bonus? Anyone can do that. If you simply say hello to those who greet you, do you expect a medal? Any run-of-the-mill sinner does that. In a word, what I'm saying is grow up. Your kingdom subjects. Now live like it. Live out of your God-created identity. Live generously and graciously towards others the way God lives towards you. So if you're here today or you have a friend and a family member that has made such terrible decisions, that has walked apart from God's plan for their life and they're suffering, sometimes it takes that person to hit rock bottom. I know I've been there in my past where I hit rock bottom, but the thing about hitting rock bottom is the only place to look is up. And just like Samson, we need to cry out to the Lord, saying, please, I know I don't deserve to be delivered, but I need you anyway. And thankfully, even when we break the commands and the promises that God has given us, He never does. Please pray with me. Gracious God, we're thankful for this day. We're thankful for your word. Now, this has been a challenging series. It's been a challenging passage. The death and the destruction and the escalation of violence is just like what we're seeing in many parts of our world today. Lord, help us to be different. Help us to be ambassadors of peace and reconciliation. And when we find ourselves in those difficult parts where we want to seek revenge, where we want to get a person back for doing something to us, let us stop and let us cry out to you for the strength to be your people, created in your image, to point to your kingdom that we serve. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.